All right, so first we're going to talk about erosion by wind, okay? So you just told me this, that erosion is the process by which weathered products are moved. So we're picking up and moving what was weathered, okay? So wind is one of the ways that weathered products are moved. So where does wind erosion actually occur? It occurs in places where there is little vegetation. So when we talk vegetation, we're talking plants, trees, grass. It occurs in places where there is little water. Okay, so moisture makes the soil heavier and harder to move. So examples of this would be a beach or a desert. And what do you see at a beach or in the desert? Sand, lots and lots of sand, okay? So how does wind move sand? Wind causes the sand to actually jump and bounce. I know that sounds silly, but this is an actual thing and it's called saltation. Okay, so grains of sand only rise above the surface about a meter, which is just over 3 feet, so not terribly high, okay, even in the strongest wind. So some effects of wind erosion, the first of these is deflation. So deflation, wind removes the topsoil, so we're talking about the top layer. It lowers the land, so if we're removing the top layer, we're going to be lowered, okay? And then it leaves rock fragments that are too large to be lifted. Because if wind can't pick up something that's that heavy, the rock fragments are going to stay. But it will pick up and move those that are light enough to be moved, okay? A great example of this is the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl happened a long, long time ago, and it was just major dust storms, okay? The second thing is abrasion. We mentioned this briefly yesterday. Abrasion is when rocks get worn down and smoothed, mostly by blowing sand. Okay, so here's an example of deflation. So the top layer gets removed, okay, and then we start to see our actual rock fragments staying behind that are too heavy to be picked up and moved. The third one is dunes, okay? Dunes is when sand gets deposited by the wind and causes an actual dune to form. So these are mounds of sand that are blown by the wind. So you can see these down at the bottom, okay? So they are very common in deserts and on beaches and on the shores of large lakes. Okay, so the bottom left, you see desert, bottom right would be the beach. So who's been to the beach in here? Have you seen fences like this on the beach? Yes? Does anybody know what the purpose of them is? Or have an idea? Anybody else? So they kind of act as a barrier. So when the wind picks up the sand and moves it, they act as a barrier so that dunes can actually form and they don't get taken past that specific area. Does that make sense? So like, what are those things called that you might build in a yard with brick? You know what I'm talking about? Kind of, but there's another name for it. You know what I'm talking about though, right? Yeah. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Like in a yard somewhere, typically that might have like hills or like be kind of slopey, a recess wall. Yeah. You put a recess wall, does anybody know what I'm talking about? No. Nobody knows what I'm talking about? No? Might be a northern thing because it's pretty flat down here. You know what I'm talking about? You do? So you build like a recess wall, okay? So these dunes or these fences act as a barrier, okay? All right, let's see if we paid attention. Saltation is the jumping and bouncing movement of sand. True or false? True or false? True, very, very true. Deflation is when rocks get worn down and smoothed mostly by blowing sand. True or false? That is false. What's the answer? Begins with an A. Say what? AB. What do you get on your knee if you whack it on the pavement or scrape it on the pavement? What do you get on your knee? AB. ABR. Abrasion. There you go. Boom. All right, next one. Sand that is deposited by wind forms dunes. True or false? True. Very true. And the last one, wind erosion generally occurs where there's a lot of vegetation and a lot of water. True or false? Give it a try. True or false? 50-50. False. What's the correct answer? What words do we need to take out of there to make that true? Say what? It's up there twice. What words do you see up there twice in that last statement? A lot. Okay? So the correct answer would be very little. Very little vegetation, very little water. Think the desert and the beach. Okay, now I know there's a lot of water at the beach, but on the actual beach, what is it? Sand. Okay, and do we see plants typically or different things like that? And in the desert, do you see a lot of that? Okay, so think that direction. Okay, all right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is glaciers, and we've mentioned glaciers briefly when we talked about climate and climate change. Okay, the glaciers melt due to global warming, and what happens to the sea levels? They rise. Okay, so what are glaciers? Glaciers are very large moving masses of ice. They form near Earth's poles, north and south, okay, and in mountains at high elevations. So typically areas where more snow falls than it actually will melt. The snow in these areas is compacted and recrystallized into ice. So an example of this is making an actual snowball. Anybody ever played in the snow here? You want to build a snowman? Nothing. Nobody saw Frozen? Who's seen Frozen in here? Do I got any Disney peeps? All right. What's his name? Olaf, right? Help me out here. Olaf, is that his name? All right. My nephew was him one year for Halloween. It was pretty cute. All right. So world glaciers. They cover 10% of the Earth's surface. So if all land ice melts, ocean will rise about 230 feet. So in the last actual ice age, the glaciers covered about 30%. So this ice age ended 10,000 years ago. Okay. There are two types, valley and continental, and we're going to talk about each of those. So valley glaciers are formed in valleys in mountainous areas. So in the valley, so valleys, peaks, okay? So they flow down the valleys like a thick liquid, kind of like a slushy, because a slushy is thick, right? But it's still liquid. So these glaciers will carve and widen an actual valley. So valley down here, peaks or mountains up here. Continental glaciers, also known like an ice sheet. A continental glacier covers a continent-sized area. So examples of this would be Antarctica and Greenland. So a lot of people confuse Greenland and Iceland because you hear the word Iceland, and what do you think? Ice, right? Okay, and that is actually not the case. Greenland, which you would think is the complete opposite, is an example of this. So they form in very cold polar regions. So Antarctica and Greenland are great, great examples. So some advancing and retreating. So when we have glaciers that are changing size, we call them advancing and retreating. So advancing glaciers are growing while retreating glaciers are shrinking. So think advance, move ahead, right? So we're growing. And then if we are retreating, that means going backwards. So think shrinking, okay? So modern day glaciers are shrinking from a global increase in temperature, and this takes us back to climate change and global warming, okay? So all of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere heating up, the glaciers are melting, and therefore sea levels rise. Icebergs come from glaciers in a process called calving. Okay, so the iceberg will actually break off from the continental glacier. So think of a big glacier, and then the iceberg will break off. So a piece of that glacier breaks off. One of the last pieces is till and moraine. Okay, so as glaciers move and melt, it leaves behind a sediment. Okay, and this sediment is called till. An accumulation of sediment on the sides of the glacier is what is called moraine. So the till is the actual sediment, and when that sediment builds up, that is what we call moraine. So since glaciers are ice, they leave behind a large amount of water as they melt. Okay, so think if you were to take this giant bag of ice, 20-pound bag of ice, put it in a cooler, and you left it in a warm area, what's going to happen? It's going to melt, okay? So a kettle lake is formed when a large piece of ice breaks off and is left to melt. So you get essentially a lake. There's also what is known as a meltwater stream, and this is a stream that is formed from melted glacier water. So a lake, one place, right? And a stream moves. Yes, everybody follow me. So a lake here and a stream moves. Okay, glacial deposition. So these meltwater streams can carry sediment down the glacier, and then they deposit them on the dry land. So once they go down the stream, okay, eventually there's land, typically on both sides of a stream, and this land is called an outwash plain. So exactly what it says it is. So when that stream carrying those sediments deposits, okay, that land is called an outwash plain.